Something changed that day, and at first, nothing on the outside reflected it. I woke up into the same routine, the same responsibilities, the same familiar thoughts looping in the background. There was no sign that anything extraordinary was about to happen. Until, almost without thinking, I did something small but different, not dramatic, just a shift in how I was present. And that was enough. From that moment on, things didn't explode into miracles. They started to move, subtly, as if reality had been paused, waiting for a signal it could finally respond to. What if I told you this wasn't coincidence? That what happened wasn't personal, mystical, or reserved for a few people? There is a pattern here, one most of us were never taught to notice. Modern physics has been circling it for decades, while everyday life quietly proves it again and again. And once you understand this pattern, you realize something unsettling and empowering at the same time. The universe doesn't start moving when you try harder. It starts moving the moment you shift how you show up. Before anything responds, before reality rearranges itself in subtle or dramatic ways, there is a quieter question that almost no one pauses long enough to face. Are you actually here right now? Not physically, but internally. Is your attention settled in this moment, or is it already negotiating the next hour, replaying yesterday, rehearsing a future that hasn't arrived? Most people move through their lives fragmented. The body is in one place, the mind in another, the emotional tone lagging somewhere behind both. And yet they wonder why nothing seems to respond to them, why intentions feel ignored, why effort produces so little movement. Presence is not a spiritual luxury. It is the basic condition for interaction with reality itself. Modern physics uses precise language to describe this. In any system, measurement matters. Observation changes outcomes. But outside the laboratory, this idea becomes uncomfortable because it suggests something personal, that the quality of your attention is not neutral. It participates. A scattered observer produces a noisy result. A coherent observer produces clarity. The universe, in that sense, is less like a vending machine and more like a responsive instrument. It doesn't answer demands shouted from a distracted mind. It resonates with what is stable enough to be felt. You can notice this without believing anything mystical. Think of the simplest human interaction. When you speak to someone who is only half listening, the conversation thins out. Words land poorly. Nuance disappears. When someone is fully present with you, even silence becomes meaningful. Reality behaves the same way. Presence is the channel. Without it, signals distort. Most people assume they are present because they are awake, but presence is not the absence of sleep. It is the absence of internal noise dominating the moment. There is a difference between seeing and noticing, between hearing and listening. The moment your attention is anchored, something subtle happens in the body. Breathing slows slightly. Muscles stop bracing for what comes next. Decisions become less reactive. This is not philosophy, it is observable physiology. Try something small, almost unremarkable. As you read this, notice where your jaw is. Is it clenched? Let it loosen. Notice your shoulders. Are they lifted as if preparing for impact? Let them drop a fraction. Nothing dramatic, just enough to register the shift. That simple adjustment already changes the quality of how you are here. Presence is often that quiet. When presence is absent, people compensate with force. They push intentions harder, repeat affirmations louder, visualize more intensely. But force applied from fragmentation only amplifies the noise. It's like trying to tune a radio while constantly turning the dial back and forth. The signal never stabilizes long enough to lock in. The universe doesn't respond to effort layered on top of distraction. It responds to coherence. There is also a bias worth checking here. The mind loves to believe it is present because the alternative is unsettling. If things aren't working, it feels safer to blame timing, luck, or external resistance than to notice how rarely attention actually rests. But presence can be tested honestly. Can you stay with one sensation, one thought, one task without drifting for even 30 seconds? If not, that's not a failure. It's data. Another subtle self-deception is mistaking intensity for presence. Strong emotion can feel immersive. but it often pulls attention into story rather than into the moment itself. Presence is quieter than excitement, calmer than urgency. It doesn't shout, "This matters." It simply stays. When presence begins to stabilize, reality often feels different before it looks different. Time stretches slightly. Choices feel less pressured. You start responding instead of reacting. And this is where many people get confused, because nothing external has changed yet. The same environment, the same challenges. But internally the signal has cleared. This is why presence is not just a spiritual concept, but a functional one. Without it, any attempt to influence reality is like sending instructions through a broken connection. With it, even small shifts carry weight. And here is where things start to become uncomfortable for the ego, because presence removes the illusion of control. You cannot force presence. The moment you try to dominate the moment, you leave it. That tension is important because it exposes the next obstacle. Once you begin to sense presence, the instinct is to use it, to make something happen with it. But that impulse, subtle as it is, already pulls you out again. This is where most people unknowingly sabotage themselves, mistaking effort for alignment, control for participation. And that opens the door to the real blockage almost no one wants to look at: the need to force reality instead of meeting it. The biggest mistake that blocks manifestation is not doubt, fear, or even inconsistency. It's something far more ingrained and far less questioned: the impulse to force reality into compliance. Most people don't realize they are doing it because it has been normalized. We are taught early that effort equals control, that pushing harder produces results, that tension is proof of commitment, and so, when something matters deeply, the instinct is to grip tighter. At first, this feels productive. You focus intensely, you plan, you repeat the intention, you monitor outcomes, but beneath all of that activity is a subtle message being broadcast: things are not okay unless this happens. That message is not verbal. It lives in the nervous system. And reality responds to that signal, long before it responds to words or thoughts. From a systems perspective, forcing creates noise. Any complex system under pressure becomes less adaptive. You can see this in the body. When someone tries to control their breathing, it becomes shallow. When they try to force sleep, it disappears. The same principle applies to consciousness interacting with the world. The tighter the grip, the less information flows back. What makes this mistake so persistent is that it masquerades as responsibility. Letting go is often confused with giving up. But these are not the same movement. Giving up is disengagement. Letting go is removing interference. One is collapse, the other is coherence. Most people never test the difference because control feels safer than openness, even when it doesn't work. There's a quiet experiment you can run in daily life. Notice how often your attention leans forward into the future, trying to secure an outcome before it exists. The body often reveals this first: a tightening in the chest, a subtle holding of breath, a jaw set as if bracing. These are not signs of alignment, they are signs of resistance. And resistance, paradoxically, is what blocks movement. Physics offers a useful analogy here without turning mystical. In unstable systems, too much external constraint reduces flexibility. The system loses its ability to reorganize intelligently. Forcing an outcome may produce short-term results, but it collapses the range of possible solutions. You get what you push for, or nothing at all. And when nothing happens, the response is usually more force. Another bias worth checking is the belief that control equals clarity. Many people assume that if they don't actively manage every step, chaos will take over. But often, the opposite is true. Excess control fragments attention. It pulls consciousness out of the present and into constant evaluation. Am I closer? Did it work? Why hasn't it happened yet? Each question reasserts the same underlying signal of lack. This is where manifestation quietly stalls, not because the intention is wrong, but because the emotional posture contradicts it. You cannot embody trust while monitoring reality for proof every few minutes. You cannot signal sufficiency while acting as if everything depends on your vigilance. The universe doesn't interpret your desire. It mirrors your state. There is also a subtle emotional addiction involved. Forcing gives the mind something to do. It creates the feeling of agency, even when nothing changes. Releasing control can feel disorienting at first, almost empty. Without the familiar tension, there is a moment where the mind doesn't know how to participate. That pause is often misread as stagnation, when it is actually the first sign of alignment. Pay attention to what happens when you stop pushing for a brief moment. Not indefinitely, just enough to feel the shift. Thoughts slow, sensations become clearer. You may even notice impulses arise that weren't there before, small practical movements that feel obvious only in hindsight. This is not passivity, it is responsiveness. Still, many people resist this because they equate surrender with weakness. But in complex systems, adaptability is strength. Water moves around obstacles not because it is passive, but because it is coherent. Forcing tries to impose form from the outside. Alignment allows form to emerge from within the system itself. This doesn't mean you stop acting. It means action comes from clarity rather than anxiety. There is a different quality to it, less urgency, more precision. And this is where something important begins to reveal itself. When control drops, attention turns inward. You start to notice the internal patterns that have been running the show all along, because the truth is, forcing reality is usually a compensation, an attempt to override something unresolved inside. And until that internal structure is seen clearly, any effort to change the external world will feel heavy, which leads directly to a deeper question most people never ask. If reality feels resistant, what kind of internal code is currently running the system? Your consciousness is the source code of reality, whether you are aware of it or not. That sentence can sound abstract until you look closely at how your inner patterns quietly shape everything you experience, not your wishes, not your goals, the patterns that run automatically beneath them. Think about how software works. What you see on a screen is never the program itself. It's the output of instructions running invisibly in the background. When something glitches, the problem is rarely the screen. It's the code. Reality functions in a similar way. What shows up in your life is not responding to what you say you want, but to the deeper instructions your consciousness is executing moment by moment. Most people try to change the screen. They focus on outcomes, circumstances, and surface behaviors. When something doesn't work, they refresh, restart, or push harder. But if the underlying code remains the same, the results keep repeating in different forms. New faces, same dynamics. New goals, same resistance. This repetition is not bad luck, it's consistency. Consciousness in this sense is not just awareness. It is the sum of your expectations, emotional habits, attention patterns, and identity-level assumptions. These elements combine into a set of rules about what feels normal, possible, or threatening. And reality, like any adaptive system, tends to stabilize around those rules. You can see this clearly in small, everyday situations. Two people walk into the same room. One notices opportunities, connections, subtle cues. The other notices obstacles, tension, reasons to stay guarded. The room didn't change. The code interpreting it did. Over time, those interpretations don't just color perception, they influence behavior, decisions, and timing. Eventually, they shape outcomes that appear external and objective. There's an important bias to catch here. The mind often assumes that consciousness is passive, that it merely observes a fixed world. But neuroscience and psychology have shown for decades that perception is predictive. The brain constantly guesses what is about to happen and adjusts behavior accordingly. In other words, your inner model of reality leads and experience follows closely behind. This is where the idea of source code becomes practical. If your default inner state is braced for disappointment, you will unconsciously filter for confirmation. If it's calibrated to struggle, ease may feel suspicious or undeserved. None of this is deliberate. That's the point. Code runs whether you look at it or not. And here's where many people misunderstand alignment. They try to overwrite the code with affirmations, visualizations, or forced positivity. But surface-level instructions can't override core architecture. You can't paste new lines on top of a program that's still executing conflicting commands underneath. That creates crashes, not coherence. The deeper code lives in the body as much as the mind. Emotional reflexes, stress responses, the speed at which you move, how quickly you assume something will go wrong. These are not thoughts, they are settings. And settings determine how signals are processed before conscious choice even enters the picture. There is a subtle moment where this becomes visible. When something unexpected happens, notice your first internal reaction before the story forms. Is it openness or contraction, curiosity or defense? That instant response reveals far more about your source code than any intention you've declared. Changing code doesn't happen through force. It happens through awareness and repetition. When a system notices its own pattern, without immediately trying to fix it, something interesting occurs. Flexibility increases. New responses become possible. The code begins to update, not because it's being attacked, but because it's being seen. This is also where patience becomes functional, rather than moral. Code doesn't rewrite itself instantly. It adapts through consistent feedback. Each time you respond from presence instead of reflex, the system registers a new option. Each time you pause instead of forcing, the architecture loosens slightly. These shifts are small, but they compound. Another misconception to clear is the idea that you must know exactly what code you want to install. Most of the time, clarity emerges after coherence, not before it. When internal noise drops, the system naturally selects better instructions. You don't have to design the entire program. You have to stop running contradictory commands. As this happens, reality often feels strangely cooperative, even before anything dramatic changes. Less friction, fewer unnecessary detours, encounters that feel timely instead of random. Not because the universe is suddenly obeying you, but because your consciousness is no longer fighting itself, and this leads to a subtle but powerful shift. If your consciousness is the source code, then asking reality to change is secondary. The more important movement is tuning the code itself, not demanding outcomes, but adjusting the internal state from which outcomes emerge. Which brings us to a critical transition. Once you stop trying to rewrite reality from the outside and begin to sense how your inner code is operating, a question naturally arises. If effort and asking haven't worked, and control only creates resistance, what happens when you stop asking altogether and start tuning into the state you would occupy if the code were already updated? The turning point comes quietly, and that is why most people miss it. There is no dramatic moment where reality suddenly answers back. No clear signal that says, now you're doing it right. Instead, it begins when something subtle drops away. The habit of asking. Not because asking is wrong, but because it keeps consciousness positioned in a posture of waiting. Asking at its core assumes absence. It reinforces the sense that something is missing here and now and must arrive from somewhere else. Even when the words sound hopeful, the emotional structure underneath often carries tension. A leaning forward, a reaching, and as long as that posture is active, consciousness is oriented toward lack rather than resonance. Tuning in is a different movement altogether. It doesn't point outward. It doesn't negotiate with reality. It listens. And listening requires stillness of a particular kind. Not silence, but receptivity. The shift is internal, almost imperceptible, yet everything reorganizes around it. You can feel the difference immediately if you pay attention to the body. Asking tightens, tuning softens, asking accelerates the mind. Tuning slows it just enough to notice what's already present. This is not resignation, it's precision. When the noise drops, finer signals become detectable. Most people believe that to receive something, they must keep it in constant focus. But attention and fixation are not the same thing. Fixation collapses awareness into a single narrow channel. Attention, when relaxed, expands perception. And expanded perception is what allows alignment to occur without force. There's a moment, often brief at first, where you stop narrating what should happen next. The inner commentary pauses. In that pause, you may notice a feeling that doesn't match your current circumstances, a sense of steadiness, relief, or quiet confidence that seems unearned. This is where people get confused. They think they are pretending, but they're not imagining an outcome, they're sampling a state. That state is not emotional excitement, it's familiarity. The emotional tone of "this is already handled" without needing proof. And this is the key distinction. Tuning in is not visualizing the future, it's stabilizing the internal conditions that would exist if the future were already integrated. The mind often resists this because it feels like losing leverage. If you stop asking, how will reality know what you want? But this assumes that reality responds to instructions rather than signals. In complex systems, coherence always carries more information than commands. A tuning fork doesn't ask another instrument to vibrate. It simply holds its frequency. Resonance does the rest. This is why repetition of requests rarely works the way people expect. The words repeat, but the state doesn't change. Tuning in flips that dynamic. The words may disappear entirely, but the state becomes consistent. And consistency, not intensity, is what systems respond to. There is also a psychological trap here worth noticing. When you stop asking, the ego fears irrelevance. It worries that without effort, nothing will happen. This fear often triggers a return to old habits, checking, affirming, pushing. But if you stay with the discomfort just a little longer, something else emerges, a sense of internal alignment that doesn't depend on outcome. This alignment is not passive. It subtly reorganizes behavior. Choices become cleaner. Timing improves. You say no more easily to things that don't fit. Yes arises without justification. These changes feel natural, not strategic, which is why people often underestimate their impact. From the outside, it may look like nothing is happening. But internally, the system has shifted from output mode to calibration mode. And calibration always precedes effective movement. Instruments are tuned before they are played. Systems are aligned before they scale. Notice how different this is from trying to convince yourself of something. Tuning in doesn't argue with the mind. It bypasses it. It works through sensation, breath, posture, and emotional tone. It's embodied, not conceptual. That's why it feels real even before circumstances change. As this becomes more familiar, asking starts to feel unnecessary, even intrusive. Not because desire disappears, but because it no longer needs constant reinforcement. Desire transforms into orientation. Instead of wanting something to happen, you begin to inhabit the quality of experience that something would produce. And this is where the shift deepens. Once you are no longer broadcasting requests, what remains is a signal, a frequency, something wordless but precise. Reality doesn't respond to explanations, it responds to this underlying vibration. Which leads to the next realization, often uncomfortable at first. If outcomes are inconsistent, it's not because you didn't ask clearly enough. It's because the signal underneath your words hasn't stabilized yet. And that signal is not linguistic. It's energetic, emotional, and embodied. The field doesn't listen to what you say. It listens to what you are broadcasting without speaking. The field responds to what you vibrate, not to what you say. And this is where many well-intentioned people unknowingly undermine themselves. Language feels powerful because it is conscious, deliberate, and familiar. We are taught that clear requests produce clear results. But the field you are interacting with does not process grammar, logic, or persuasion. It responds to patterns, states, and coherence. You can say the right words while transmitting the wrong signal. In fact, this happens more often than not. Someone may affirm abundance while their body is tense, their breath shallow, their attention fixed on what might go wrong. The spoken message says, "I have," but the vibration underneath says, "I'm bracing." The field doesn't average those inputs. It follows the dominant frequency, and the dominant frequency is almost always non-verbal. Vibration is not mystical energy floating around you. It's the sum of how your nervous system is organized in a given moment, your emotional baseline, the speed of your thoughts, the degree of trust or vigilance shaping your perception. These elements form a signal that is continuous, not occasional. You broadcast it while speaking, while acting, and especially while doing nothing at all. This explains why repetition without embodiment rarely works. Saying something once or 1,000 times does not matter if the internal state remains unchanged. The field is not counting words, it is responding to consistency. A stable emotional tone carries more influence than any carefully constructed statement, layered on top of instability. You can observe this in ordinary human dynamics. Someone can tell you they are confident, but if their posture is collapsed and their voice strained, you feel the mismatch immediately. You don't need to analyze it. Your system reads theirs. The same kind of reading happens constantly between your internal state and the larger field of events you are embedded in. There is a subtle discomfort in realizing this because it removes the safety of performance. You can no longer rely on saying the right thing. You have to notice what you are actually inhabiting, and that requires honesty that is quieter than motivation and more precise than hope. A useful check is to notice what you are vibrating when nothing is happening. Not during intention setting, not during focused practice, but in the unguarded moments. Waiting in line, lying in bed before sleep, driving without music. These moments reveal the baseline signal. That baseline, not your peak effort, is what the field responds to most reliably. Many people discover here that their vibration contradicts their stated desires. They want expansion, but their system is calibrated for caution. They want connection, but their default state is self-protection. This is not a flaw, it is conditioning. And conditioning doesn't dissolve because it's argued with. It changes when it's met with awareness and gradually given a new reference point. Another bias to watch is the belief that vibration must be high to work. This creates unnecessary pressure and often leads to emotional suppression. The field does not require positivity, it requires coherence. A calm, grounded sadness is more coherent than forced optimism layered over anxiety. Authentic states stabilize faster than performative ones. As coherence increases, vibration naturally shifts, not upward in some abstract hierarchy, but inward towards steadiness. You feel less compelled to convince yourself or anyone else. You stop scanning for signs that it's working, that scanning itself was part of the old signal, rooted in doubt and urgency. At this stage, subtle feedback begins to appear. Small interactions feel smoother. Timing improves without effort. Obstacles rearrange rather than confront. These are not rewards, they are responses. The field is mirroring a clearer signal back to you. Still, many people miss this phase because they are looking for dramatic confirmation. When it doesn't arrive, they revert to words. More affirmations, more declarations, more mental effort. And with that, the vibration destabilizes again. The challenge is to trust what cannot yet be proven, to stay with the felt sense of alignment even when circumstances lag behind. This is not blind faith, it's signal integrity. If you keep changing the broadcast because the echo hasn't returned fast enough, the field has nothing stable to respond to. Over time, this reveals something important. Words are not useless, but they are secondary. They work when they arise from an embodied state rather than trying to create one. Speech that emerges from coherence reinforces it. Speech used to compensate for incoherence only amplifies the mismatch. As this understanding settles, a new question naturally arises. If the field responds to vibration, not language, then effort must be directed not at saying more, but at stabilizing the signal itself. And that brings us to a paradox that confuses almost everyone at first. The moment you stop gripping your desire, stop monitoring it, stop feeding it with words, something begins to reorganize on its own. Because detachment, when misunderstood, looks like indifference. But in reality, it is often the purest form of alignment. The paradox of detachment is that it works only when it is misunderstood at first. Most people hear the word and immediately think of indifference, withdrawal, or pretending not to care. But real detachment has nothing to do with apathy. It is not the absence of desire. It is the absence of tension around desire. And that distinction changes everything. When you're attached, your attention grips the outcome. It leans forward constantly, checking, measuring, comparing. Even when nothing is happening externally, something is happening internally. Vigilance. That vigilance sends a clear signal to the field. It says, this is not resolved yet, stay alert. And so reality mirrors that state back to you, not as punishment, but as feedback. Detachment removes that vigilance without removing intention. It is the internal movement of standing upright again instead of leaning. Desire is still present, but it no longer pulls your nervous system into the future. You remain here, now, steady. And from that steadiness, a very different interaction with reality becomes possible. This is where the paradox appears. The moment you stop watching the door for the thing to arrive, the system relaxes. And when the system relaxes, it becomes adaptive. Possibilities that were previously blocked by tension can now reorganize. To the mind, this feels backwards. Surely caring less should produce less. Yet in complex systems, reduced interference often produces more intelligent outcomes. You can see this principle everywhere once you start noticing it. When you stop trying to remember a name, it appears. When you stop forcing sleep, the body rests. When you stop over-directing a conversation, it deepens. Detachment does not create results by absence of effort, but by removal of resistance. The difficulty is that detachment cannot be performed. The moment you try to let go in order to get something, you are still attached. The grip just becomes more subtle. This is why many people say detachment doesn't work for them. They are using it as a technique rather than allowing it as a shift. True detachment happens when you recognize that your internal state does not need to be held hostage by an external outcome. This recognition is not intellectual, it is felt. There is a moment where you realize, quietly, that you are okay right now, even without proof. That realization loosens something deep in the system. At first, this can feel unsettling. The identity that has been managing, planning, and monitoring feels momentarily unnecessary. Without its usual job, it may generate anxiety or boredom. This is often misread as something going wrong. In reality, it is a recalibration. The system is learning a new baseline. Another bias worth noticing is the belief that detachment means passivity. But detachment does not stop action. It changes the quality of action. Instead of acting to reduce anxiety, you act from clarity. Instead of pushing to secure an outcome, you respond to what is actually needed in the moment. The actions may look similar from the outside, but internally they feel completely different. There is also an emotional honesty required here. Detachment does not mean suppressing disappointment or pretending not to want something. It means allowing those feelings to exist without letting them dictate your state. You feel desire without urgency. You feel uncertainty without collapse. That emotional flexibility is a sign of coherence, not weakness. As detachment stabilizes, something interesting happens. Your attention returns fully to the present. And presence, as you've already seen, is where interaction with reality becomes precise. Without the constant pull of when will it happen, you begin to notice what is already moving. Small shifts, unexpected openings, subtle invitations to act or wait. Many people miss these signals because they are still focused on the imagined final result. Detachment widens perception. You stop fixating on one form and start noticing multiple pathways. And often, the form that arrives is different from what you originally asked for, but functionally aligned with the state you stabilized. This is where trust begins to replace control, not blind trust, but experiential trust. You start to see that when you are internally aligned, life responds in ways that don't require constant management. This doesn't mean everything becomes easy. It means friction becomes informative rather than threatening. The paradox resolves itself gradually. You realize that holding tightly was never the source of movement. It was the source of delay, and letting go was never about giving up. It was about removing distortion from the signal you were sending all along. As this becomes clearer, another question emerges naturally. If detachment allows the field to respond more intelligently, then why has this understanding taken so long to surface? Why does it still feel controversial to say that consciousness participates in outcomes? Especially when certain experiments have been quietly suggesting this for decades, even if science hesitates to draw the larger conclusion. Science already knows this, but avoids saying it, not because the evidence is weak, but because the implications are uncomfortable. For more than a century, physics has been quietly revealing cracks in the old idea of a detached, objective universe. Yet every time those cracks widen, language tightens, conclusions soften, interpretations are hedged, not because the data disappears, but because what the data suggests challenges a worldview built on separation. At the heart of this tension is observation. In classical thinking, observation is passive. You look, and the world simply is what it is. But at the quantum level, that assumption collapses. Outcomes change depending on how and whether something is observed. Particles behave differently when measured. Possibilities narrow into actualities in ways that cannot be explained without acknowledging the role of the observer. This is not fringe science. These results are foundational. Entire technologies depend on them. And yet, when the conversation drifts toward consciousness, there is a sudden reluctance. The math is accepted. The experiments are repeatable, but the meaning is carefully avoided, as if naming the implication would somehow contaminate the rigor. The avoidance makes sense historically. Science advanced by removing the human element wherever possible. Objectivity became synonymous with credibility. To suggest that consciousness participates in outcomes sounds at first like a regression. Too subjective, too close to belief, and so the language stays technical, even when the phenomenon is anything but. Instead of saying consciousness affects reality, papers talk about measurement interaction. Instead of acknowledging awareness, they reference information exchange. These are not wrong terms, they are precise, but they also create distance. They allow the conversation to remain safely abstract, removed from lived experience. What's rarely acknowledged is that science itself is an activity of consciousness. Every experiment begins with a choice of what to measure, how to measure it, and what counts as meaningful data. These choices are not neutral. They arise from assumptions, priorities, and models held by human minds. The observer was never absent, only unnamed. There is also a deeper discomfort. If consciousness is not just witnessing reality but participating in it, then responsibility expands. Outcomes are no longer fully external. You can't attribute everything to randomness or mechanical causation. The line between inner state and outer event becomes porous, and that has ethical and psychological consequences science has not been trained to navigate. So the conversation stalls at the edge. The data points inward, but the interpretation stops short. The door is left slightly open, but no one is invited to walk through it officially. Instead, the findings are compartmentalized, useful for technology, dangerous for philosophy. Interestingly, other fields have begun circling the same insight from different angles. Neuroscience shows that perception is constructed, not received raw. Psychology demonstrates that expectation shapes experience. Decision science reveals that internal states bias outcomes long before conscious choice appears. These are not spiritual claims. They are empirical observations. Yet together they suggest a reality that is far more participatory than previously assumed. Still, there is caution. Not because the idea is false, but because it's easily misused. The fear is that acknowledging consciousness as causal will invite magical thinking, oversimplification, or blame. And those concerns are valid. But avoidance is not the same as discernment. Silence does not prevent distortion. It simply leaves the conversation to less rigorous voices. What science hesitates to say explicitly, lived experience often confirms quietly. People notice that when their internal state stabilizes, circumstances respond differently. Not perfectly, not instantly, but measurably. Less friction, better timing, clearer decisions. These observations don't require abandoning reason. They require expanding the frame. The problem is not that science denies this outright, it's that it stops just before integration. The findings are there, but the narrative remains incomplete. Consciousness is treated as a side effect rather than a variable, and as long as that remains the case, the most practical implications stay unexamined. This creates a strange gap. On one side, a public hungry for meaning fills the space with exaggeration and certainty. On the other, institutions retreat into cautious language, unwilling to explore how inner coherence might influence external systems. Between them lies a truth that is neither mystical nor mechanical, but relational. As individuals, we don't need science's permission to notice how reality responds to our state. But understanding why the conversation has been delayed helps dissolve doubt. It explains why this feels simultaneously obvious and controversial. The data has been pointing here for a long time. It's the interpretation that lags, and as this gap slowly closes, something else becomes visible. When consciousness begins to align, the universe rarely announces it with spectacle. It starts with subtle signals, small coincidences, gentle shifts, whispers rather than declarations. And if you're not paying attention yet, you might miss the fact that movement has already begun. Signs that the universe has already begun to move are rarely dramatic. They don't arrive with certainty or confirmation. In fact, they are easy to dismiss precisely because they don't match what the mind expects movement to look like. Most people are waiting for outcomes. Reality begins with signals. One of the first signs is a shift in internal friction. Things that used to feel heavy start to require less effort, not because the task changed, but because resistance has thinned. Decisions that once triggered overthinking now feel obvious. You act not with urgency, but with a quiet sense of timing. This is not luck. It's responsiveness returning to the system. Another sign appears in the form of interruptions. Plans get subtly rerouted. Conversations happen that weren't scheduled. You hear a sentence at the exact moment you needed perspective. These moments are often dismissed as coincidence, yet they carry a specific quality: relevance. Not excitement. Relevance. They land where attention already is, not where you've been forcing it to go. As alignment stabilizes, you may notice that problems stop behaving like walls and start behaving like information. Instead of blocking you, they reveal something: a boundary, a miscalibration, a place where an old pattern is no longer viable. This can feel uncomfortable because movement doesn't always look like progress at first. Sometimes it looks like friction surfacing so it can be resolved. Another subtle indicator is a change in how you relate to time. Urgency fades. Waiting doesn't feel like stagnation anymore. There's a sense that something is unfolding even when nothing visible is happening. This is deeply counterintuitive to a mind conditioned for immediate feedback. Yet this temporal shift is often one of the clearest markers that the system is reorganizing beneath the surface. You might also notice people entering or exiting your life with little effort. Connections that once required maintenance dissolve naturally. New ones form without strategy. This isn't about destiny or fate, it's about coherence. Systems with different internal states drift apart. Systems with compatible states find each other. No force is required. There is also an internal honesty that begins to emerge. You become less willing to pretend you want things that no longer match your state. Old goals lose their charge. Not because you failed, but because they belong to an earlier version of your code. This can feel like loss if you cling to identity, but it's actually refinement. Another sign is the disappearance of compulsive checking. You stop scanning for evidence that things are working. Not because you've given up, but because the need has dropped away. When alignment is present, proof becomes less important than stability. And paradoxically, this is often when external confirmation begins to appear. Still, these signals are quiet. They don't announce themselves as success. And this is where many people misinterpret what's happening. They expect movement to be obvious, measurable, and immediate. When it isn't, they assume nothing is working and revert to force. This is one of the most common perceptual errors in this process. Early movement happens at the level of conditions, not conclusions. The soil changes before the plant breaks the surface. If you keep digging to check, you delay the growth you're trying to confirm. There's also a bias toward dramatic change. People believe that if reality is responding, it should feel extraordinary. But coherence often feels ordinary, calmer, simpler, less charged. That simplicity can be mistaken for stagnation, especially if you've been used to emotional intensity as a marker of progress. Another signal is increased sensitivity. You notice when something is slightly off. You feel misalignment sooner and correct more gently. This sensitivity is not fragility, it's resolution. A finely tuned instrument detects small variations that a blunt one misses, and because of that, adjustments happen earlier, with less cost. You may also find that when you do take action, it has disproportionate effect. One conversation resolves something that used to take weeks. One decision opens multiple pathways. This efficiency is not the result of effort, but of timing. Action taken from alignment lands differently. The challenge is that these signs require attention without attachment. If you cling to them as proof, they lose their function. They are not rewards, they are feedback. And feedback is only useful when it's observed without distortion. This is where many people stall. They sense movement, but because it doesn't match their expectations, they doubt it. They start rushing again. They abandon consistency for intensity. They quit not because nothing is happening, but because something subtle is. And that leads directly to the next obstacle. If the universe begins with whispers, and consistency matters more than urgency, then the real question becomes this: why do so many people stop just before the movement becomes undeniable? Why most people quit before seeing movement has very little to do with lack of ability or sincerity. It has everything to do with timing, perception, and conditioning. We are trained, almost from the beginning, to associate progress with immediacy. Press a button, get a response. Ask a question, receive an answer. When that rhythm is interrupted, the mind fills the gap with doubt. The early phase of alignment is deceptive because it doesn't reward effort in obvious ways. Instead of visible outcomes, it offers internal recalibration. Instead of confirmation, it offers subtlety. And subtlety is uncomfortable for a system that has learned to trust only what can be measured quickly. Most people quit not when nothing is happening, but when something unfamiliar is happening. The old indicators disappear. The emotional highs of motivation fade. The urgency that once fueled action dissolves. In their place appears something quieter, consistency without drama. To a conditioned mind, this feels like loss of momentum rather than the beginning of stability. There is also a deeply ingrained belief that effort must feel hard to be effective. When things start to feel easier internally, suspicion arises. Am I doing enough? Did I lose focus? Shouldn't this feel more intense? These questions don't come from intuition, they come from conditioning. They pull attention back into force just as alignment begins to stabilize. Another factor is the delay between internal change and external reflection. Consciousness reorganizes first, behavior shifts next. Circumstances respond last. That lag is where most people abandon the process. They mistake delay for failure, but in complex systems, lag is not a problem. It's a feature. It allows the system to integrate changes without collapse. Impatience often disguises itself as practicality. People say they are being realistic when they demand proof quickly, but realism is not the same as immediacy. Reality itself unfolds over time. Seeds don't doubt the soil because nothing breaks the surface in the first few days, but the human mind, disconnected from natural rhythms, expects results on demand. There is also an emotional vulnerability at this stage that few talk about. When old patterns loosen and new ones aren't fully formed yet, there is a sense of limbo. You no longer relate to the past in the same way, but the future hasn't clarified. This in-between space can feel empty, and emptiness, to a mind addicted to stimulation, feels threatening. Many people rush back to old habits simply to escape that discomfort. At least struggle feels familiar. At least force provides a role to play. Alignment, by contrast, asks you to remain present without guarantees. It asks for trust without evidence, and that request alone filters out most people. Another subtle reason people quit is comparison. They look outward for validation, measuring their process against others' timelines or outcomes. This reintroduces noise. Comparison shifts attention from internal coherence to external benchmarks, reactivating urgency and self-doubt. The signal destabilizes again, and when results don't follow, discouragement sets in. There is also the misunderstanding that consistency means monotony. People believe that if nothing new is happening emotionally, nothing is happening at all. But consistency is not flatness, it's depth. It's the quiet accumulation of coherence that eventually produces visible change without warning. Ironically, the moment people quit is often the moment just before feedback would have become undeniable. The system has stabilized enough to respond, but the observer withdraws attention, collapses trust, and returns to control. The signal changes again, and the opportunity passes unnoticed. This creates a narrative of "it didn't work," when in reality it was interrupted. Not sabotaged by the universe, but by impatience. And impatience is not a flaw of character, it is a habit of perception. What's required at this stage is not more effort, but tolerance for ambiguity. The ability to remain steady without reassurance, to continue inhabiting the state without checking whether it's paying off yet. This is where alignment matures into embodiment. Most people never discover this because they keep looking for movement as something to chase. They believe the universe responds to pursuit, but pursuit implies distance, and distance implies separation. As long as something feels ahead of you, it remains so. Those who stay don't do anything extraordinary, they simply stop abandoning the process when it stops entertaining the mind. They allow consistency to replace urgency. They let presence replace pressure. And eventually, without fanfare, something clicks. Because there is a moment, quiet, precise, and irreversible, when you realize you no longer need to wait, ask, or even hope in the same way. Not because you've given up, but because something fundamental has shifted in how you relate to desire itself. And that moment is not about persistence anymore. It's about understanding what changes everything. The moment that changes everything is not dramatic. It doesn't arrive with certainty or relief. There is no internal announcement that says, now it begins. In fact, if you're waiting for that kind of confirmation, you'll miss it, because this moment happens before results, before evidence, and even before confidence. It happens when something very specific drops away. It's the moment you stop chasing alignment and realize you are already standing inside it. Up until this point, every effort, even the most subtle ones, has been oriented toward movement, toward getting somewhere else, toward becoming a version of yourself that feels just out of reach. Even when the work becomes quieter and more refined, there is often still an invisible lean forward, a sense that life will truly begin once something shifts externally. And then, almost unnoticed, that leaning stops. Not because you decided it should, but because it no longer makes sense. This is the moment that changes everything. When the internal question shifts from, how do I make this happen, to, what am I embodying right now? That shift collapses distance. Suddenly the future is no longer something you're trying to reach. It becomes something you're already participating in through state. At first, this can feel anticlimactic. There's no surge of emotion, no rush of certainty, just a strange normalcy. You wake up one day and realize you're not negotiating with reality anymore. You're responding to it. You're not asking whether you're aligned. You're noticing when you aren't, and adjusting without drama. This is not resignation. It's authority of a different kind. Before this moment, desire was always paired with tension, even subtle tension. After it, desire remains, but it no longer destabilizes you. You want things without needing them to validate your state. You move toward outcomes without measuring yourself against them, and that is precisely why outcomes begin to move more freely. What changes is not what you do, but where action comes from. Actions taken before this moment are fueled by compensation. You act to fix, to prove, to secure. After this moment, action emerges as expression. You do things because they fit, not because they promise relief. This distinction is invisible from the outside, but it changes how reality responds. There is also a quiet grief that can surface here. The realization that so much effort was unnecessary, that the force, the urgency, the self-correction were never required to the degree you believed. This grief doesn't mean you were wrong. It means you were learning. And learning always looks inefficient in hindsight. Another subtle shift happens in how you relate to uncertainty. Before, uncertainty felt like a threat, something to eliminate as quickly as possible. After this moment, uncertainty becomes space. Not comfortable but workable. You stop demanding guarantees. You stop interpreting ambiguity as failure. And because of that, you stay present long enough for new information to emerge. This is where the universe appears to have no choice but to move, though that phrase can be misleading. It's not submission, it's resonance. When your internal state stops oscillating between hope and doubt, when it stabilizes into embodiment, the field finally has a clear signal to respond to. Not intermittently, not conditionally, but consistently. What's striking is how ordinary life continues around this shift. the same responsibilities, the same challenges, but your relationship to them is different. You are no longer trying to extract meaning from outcomes. Meaning is already present in how you engage. And because of that, feedback arrives faster, cleaner, with less distortion. You also stop explaining yourself internally. The endless self-commentary quiets. You don't need to justify why you're doing this work or where it's leading. That need belonged to an earlier phase, when identity was still tied to becoming rather than being. From here, manifestation stops feeling like a process and starts feeling like a byproduct. Not something you perform, but something that follows coherence. The universe doesn't respond because you figured something out. It responds because you stopped interfering, and this is why this moment can't be forced or imitated. It arrives only when the system is ready to sustain it. Any earlier, and it would collapse back into effort. Any later, and it would feel obvious. Once this shift happens, you don't announce it. You don't try to hold on to it. You simply live from it. And life, quietly, begins to meet you there. Not all at once, not perfectly, but unmistakably enough that you no longer need to ask whether something is happening. You can feel it in how you stand inside the moment now, without leaning forward, without pulling back, aware that whatever moves next is not something you need to chase, but something you are already aligned to recognize. Everything begins with a single inner step, and by now you already know it's not a technique, a ritual, or a strategy. It's a shift, a quiet decision to stop trying to force reality and start meeting it from a different place. When that shift happens, nothing outside needs to change immediately for everything inside to reorganize. And that reorganization is what the universe responds to first. You were never late. You were never blocked. You were simply learning how to align instead of chase, how to embody instead of ask, how to remain present long enough for coherence to take root. From here, movement is no longer something you wait for. It's something you recognize. If this message reached you, it's because you stayed with it. And to let me know you made it to the end, write this exact phrase in the comments. I chose alignment. And if this resonated with you and you want to go deeper, choose one of the videos appearing on the screen now. They continue this path from a new angle, and they're here for you when you're ready.